Minister, at the weekend, when asked to explain the spiralling homelessness figures, the Taoiseach blamed vulnerable migrants. He said homeless numbers were now heavily impacted by people seeking international protection. This, as you know, is not true. The biggest correlating factor with rising homelessness in Ireland is not rising migration, it's Fine Gael and government. Every year, for more than a decade, homeless figures have increased. Nearly 14,500 people are now homeless, including nearly 4,500 children. This, of course, is an indictment not of vulnerable migrants, but of this and previous governments. People at home will be interested to know that people seeking international protection are not counted in the monthly homeless figures. They are not entitled to stay in emergency accommodation. Under this government, they're not even guaranteed a bed or a tent. In fact, this government's treatment of international protection applicants is so appalling that the High Court has found it unlawful. But that hasn't stopped the Taoiseach from trying to shift the blame from government onto migrants. Saying that migrants are the cause of rising homelessness is a textbook dog whistle. It validates and normalises the dangerous far-right narrative that migrants are the cause of the problems that people are facing. Yesterday, Mercy Law, who are experts in housing law, issued a lengthy demolition of the Taoiseach's comments. They stated the causes of homelessness are multifaceted and directly relate to decisions made by central and local government over many years. Minister, does it concern you that the Taoiseach's comments have had to be fact-checked and dismantled by legal experts? Does it concern you that in the current climate of increased racism, arson, assaults, threats and intimidation of migrants, the Taoiseach is seeking to blame them for the homelessness crisis? Last week, you gave an interview to the Sunday Times lambasting your coalition partners for putting politics over policies. Is this not a clear example of that cynical style of politics? Facing a barrage of criticism, the Taoiseach's office released homeless figures for Dublin in July to try to back up his remarks. But these didn't tell the full story. The national figures for the second quarter of this year tell us the biggest cause of homelessness is relationship breakdown. Second is getting a termination notice in the private rental sector. Third is other. And fourth is leaving direct provision, comprising of a small fraction of the overall figures. As Minister for Integration, you haven't commented on this yet. Are you concerned about the impact of this kind of dog whistling and what it will have on migrants, many of whom are already living in fear? Would you like to use this opportunity to confirm that the Taoiseach's comments were shameful scapegoating of a vulnerable minority and it was wrong?
Deputy Minister, please.
Thank you, Ken Corley. Thank you, Deputy, for the question. Just for the sake of clarity, Deputy, I spoke at some length to media about this on Monday. But I'm very happy to restate what I said at that point. And I think we have to be absolutely factual here when we are dealing with these issues, where we are in a situation where we have a homelessness crisis in our country, and many people are in really difficult situations, and where we have a humanitarian response to a crisis in the war in Ukraine, and we have seen increased levels of international protection applicants as well. And the facts are that international protection applicants have no right to housing supports, they have no right to HAP, they have no right to access homelessness services. And Ukrainians, beneficiaries of temporary protection, have no right to housing supports, no right to HAP, no right to access homelessness services. And the very tenor of the approach of this government, and this was deliberately chosen at the start of this crisis, was that my department, the Department of Children and Integration, would undertake the emergency response to the housing needs of those fleeing the war in Ukraine and those seeking international protection here. and the Department of Housing would continue its work in terms of focusing on the delivery of housing for all, on delivery of social housing, of affordable rental and affordable purchase. And that's how it's worked. And my department, in the course of 2 years, has been able to provide emergency accommodation for over 100,000 people. It's a huge quantity, and look, when we look back at it I know we're in the heat of it now, but I think when we look back at it in subsequent years, we'll acknowledge the scale of that response, and it was a scale that was enabled by support of communities all over our country. So I absolutely agree with the Taoiseach when he says we should not blame vulnerable groups in our society for the pressures on housing that we see. We've set out within Housing for All our approach to increasing the amount of units produced available for housing every year. We achieved 32,700 last year. We're hoping to bring it up to 40,000 this year. And that is the way that we can address the homelessness crisis within our country. Deputy, you mentioned the challenges within my own department in terms of meeting the accommodation needs of international protection applicants, and they remain very acute. And we have been found to be wanting and in breach of our legal obligations, and that's something I'm very conscious of. I am working on the implementation of the new accommodation strategy, a strategy designed on a core of state-owned accommodation, because the big problem with the system that I inherited is that it is reliant, 96% reliant on the private sector. And that's why the use of state-owned lands has been so important in recent months. So the fact that we are accommodating people in state-owned lands in Trudder, in Crooksling, in Ballyogan, and soon in the next number of weeks in Thornton Hall, that is hugely important in terms of meeting the immediate homelessness needs and being able to provide basic shelter for people when they're rough sleeping in the short term, but in the long term having improved state-provided accommodation for people who we know will continue to seek international protection here in the future.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Cairns.
Minister, ever since Simon Harris became Taoiseach, there's been a dominant message from this government to try to make the lives of international protection applicants as miserable as possible. The government has announced plans to cut their meagre allowances and to charge them to stay in institutional settings. Your own department is enforcing transfers from international protection applicants' accommodation, uprooting adults and children who've integrated into local communities. Meanwhile, efforts to evict people who have leave to remain from direct provision have been stepped up, and now the Taoiseach is attempting to blame the very people who've been failed by this government, the people you just acknowledged, for the homelessness crisis. The cynical scapegoating or scrapping of new incitement to hatred laws can also be added to the list. Minister, you haven't provided the promised state-run reception and integration centres that we so desperately need. You now have to decide if you're happy to stand over the Taoiseach's comments blaming migrants for the homelessness crisis. I'm just wondering if you can clarify if you do stand over his comments, or what do you have to say about it?
Actually, no one is evicted from international protection accommodation. I want to make that very clear. Where a situation where someone has status, they are now entitled to that full range of supports that we spoke about earlier on, that people in the international protection process aren't entitled to. Once you get your status, you're entitled to the same set of rights, the same set of supports as every Irish citizen. And we've put in place significant resources to help people who've gotten their status move on, because it's not good for anybody that they continue in those institutional settings, in direct provision settings. That's not what anybody wants. But let me be clear, nobody is evicted from these premises, even if they have leave to remain. We have transferred people across our network. We have to be able to do that, Deputy. We're under so much pressure to make sure that we can offer people who arrive newly in this country accommodation. We have to make changes. But we have, working with the Peter McVerry Trust, working with other housing NGOs, we've put in place a network of supports, and over 4,500 people have successfully moved out of international protection and into the community since 2022.
Thank you.